Hi, I'm Sebastien Couture of the Epicenter podcast. I'm here in Basel, Switzerland for the very first edition of the Hyperledger Global Forum. It was a 4-day event organized by the Linux Foundation that gathered over 700 participants, from startups to developers and enterprise, all building applications on the technologies in the Hyperledger greenhouse. So while I was at the event, I had the opportunity to speak with community members, learn about what they're building, and how they're contributing to the tools and technologies in the Hyperledger family. Here's my conversation with Jesse Chenard, CEO of MonetaGo.
My name is Jesse Chenard. I'm the co-founder of a company called MonetaGo. MonetaGo, we provide solutions for financial institutions that are primarily blockchain or DLT based, but not exclusively. We've been in the blockchain space for a number of years now, and initially we were looking at cryptos as intermediary currencies, and then we realized that we were a little bit before our time there, and we started to really look at what are use cases that are attainable, that could fit within current regulatory environments, and we've sort of come to the conclusion that right now, blockchain is a very effective messaging environment. It's very good for communicating with multiple parties, but not necessarily trying to push the regulatory limit by introducing tokens or tokenizing assets or things like that. So, if I distill it, we basically digitize financial workflows. So as we started to explore the different opportunities that were out there, working with a number of different banks on use cases, proof of concepts, we worked with the Reserve Bank of India around sort of their understanding of blockchain and what would be permissible in that environment. We encountered a number of different possible opportunities. The one that really stood out to us and was achievable was around receivables financing fraud. So 3 marketplaces were launching in India, and they had the unique problem that in a factoring scenario, it was permissible that a supplier would potentially put invoices on all 3 of their marketplaces. The problem, of course, that presents is that then if I go and accept the bids on my invoices on 3 subsequent marketplaces, I'm triple financing that invoice. So they needed a common communication layer amongst them. The problem or the challenge that they presented to us was that they didn't want to share the invoice details themselves. And so there's a couple ways you could do this. You could do it with a centralized database, create a centralized authority, but that is costly and requires audits and requires someone to run it. So we thought, kind of a unique solution here. Why don't we just stand up a node for each of these participants, and instead of sharing the invoice details, create a hash of the invoice itself. Such that whatever is written to the blockchain is not really identifiable to any of the participants, but if they wind up putting the same invoice through the hashing algorithm, they're going to wind up with that exact same hash or fingerprint, if you will. We dumb it down by calling it fingerprinting. But so that launched in March of this year, 2018. And as we started to sort of publicize that, we realized that the rest of the factoring industry wanted to join as well. So that can be banks, non-banking financial companies, and other fintechs that are in the space. And we started to see that there was a real need there. The factoring business is traditionally somewhat siloed. So you do a whole bunch of checks on the buyer, you do a whole bunch of checks on the seller, but then you sort of have faith that the invoice is valid, that it's not being financed elsewhere, and that's where the opportunity for fraud comes in. So we're in the process of taking that to a few other geographies where factoring and fraud are presented as problems. I think that the blockchain, as I said before, what we're doing could be solved by a database, a replicated database, centralized authority. But what you start to see there is that you wind up with duplicating your technology costs or what have you. And as I sort of look at blockchain, I think of it as really a common technology platform. So if you've got a standard set of functions that everyone in your industry needs to perform, why go to a bunch of different systems integrators or build your own homegrown solution or what have you, and duplicate that cost across the industry? So although right now we're really just providing an information network for these folks to be able to communicate this, sort of this simple function, the longer term goal is to get them to start to run their business processes through there, so that they reduce their costs around it. My background is actually in IT and computing, building distributed systems and things like that. I've been doing that for 20 years. And that's what really excites me about it is the notion that much like the open source or the open source movement, you've got this common set of technology functions, whether it be a web server, whether it be a database, that everybody needs. It's not sort of a highly tailored thing or what have you. So why not make this freely available? Why not share the costs of development? Why not share the overhead and the burden around it? So we think that blockchain. I think the blockchain is really a step into secure distributed computing, less so a mechanism for passing tokens or what have you. So we primarily worked with Hyperledger Fabric. It's the one that we've got in production right now for the fraud mitigation network. It's also the one we're deploying in the other geographies. When we first started down this path of working with the banks and financial institutions and the Reserve Bank in India and trying to figure out what was permissible and what wasn't, the only tech out there at the time or mature enough blockchain was Ethereum. Ethereum presented a number of different problems for us. A, in that it was broadcast based. B, that it still required a proof of work, so it can be somewhat intensive. And luckily for us, the Hyperledger Foundation got formed right around the time when we were sort of getting things off the ground over there. So initially we joined really just to sort of take a flyer and see what other people in the industry were doing. The tool sets weren't all put together at that point yet. But we were extremely impressed. I mean, the rate of development that went from getting it to 0.64 to 1.0 was breakneck speed. When we had initially done our few proof of concepts for a number of the banks over there, I had thought there's no way that we're going to be able to use Hyperledger because it's just not going to be ready in time for our timeline. Sure enough, it was. So even the proof of concepts that we did with the Reserve Bank it was based on Hyperledger 0.64. I think that the notion that a small company like ours and the large players like IBM, Accenture, and Intel can all come together and somewhat work together to solve these problems, is pretty amazing. And the other piece that I think that I like about it is that these have been designed from the ground up to to solve some of these problems in the financial services world. For example, we can't broadcast a lot of data that is sensitive, so you need this concept of channels that you have within Fabric, and it's kind of like it's been tailor-made for a lot of the problems that we've been trying to attack. So the support that we've seen from Hyperledger has been across obviously having access to this great tool set, having input, being able to get feedback. The training that's coming out now is, I think going to be quite advantageous for us and as well as the industry. But it's not only that, Hyperledger is very inclusive. So at Sibos, they invite the members and you can go and you can work the booth. And I found that I get more business out of standing at the Hyperledger booth than if I go and try and set up meetings by myself. So there's, and then there's also the promotion of the members within the community. Brian and the rest of the team have been very pointed in their efforts to not just have IBM and Accenture and the big names on stage. Quite often, it's MonetaGo and Intellect EU and Brian sitting on a panel. So it's kind of, we feel like it's a real democratization of the overall sort of ecosystem, and that's, I think, one of the big benefits that we've seen is that although we're not a major or a large player, our voice is heard just as equally. So, I think the improvements on the tech, more open source applications building onto that stack. I was speaking with a fellow last night from the government of British Columbia about an identity project that he's working on, and he's open sourcing the whole thing and get it under the Hyperledger umbrella. So I think, there's obviously going to be sort of the blocking and tackling, so the scaling and performance type improvements that continue to come out with each point release. But then also as some of these projects that are under the umbrella mature to 1.0 and become usable and interchangeable and interoperable, I think that's where it's going to become easier to churn these use cases out, and then I think also just getting more production deployments out there is what I think we're excited about, not just for ourselves but for the entire community. I kind of feel like the rising tide floats, it lifts all the boats, right?